Will you pray with me? Lord, please help us to discover by these words I bring tonight the inner meaning of our faith, which is always active in love. May the words I speak be acceptable to you. Amen. Easter is gone. You know, I always feel that is the most important of our holy year. It always stands out to me because to me it brings home the meaning of my faith. Christmas doesn't mean as much, but the Easter story does. Following on the busy Easter, we get the feeling we know of watching a great tragedy filled with incredible scenes of all those decades ago. And this week I had so many different thoughts on the way I was going to give this sermon. You know, when you're preparing a sermon, you read the Bible over and over again until eventually you try to interpret it in a modern way, so that those who have difficulty trying to understand the Bible hopefully will understand it more. My memory is not good. It comes with old age. And I found I was trying too hard to find a modern way of explaining that reappearance of Jesus after the crucifixion and the resurrection. I opened my computer on Thursday, determined to sit down and start. Checked my emails, and my attention was immediately drawn to one from the Duke of York, the cinema. Screaming out at me were these words: "The brain sees what it wants to see." And it carried on with, "This week we are very excited to present Ghost Stories, a horror stage show starring Andy Nyman as an arch skeptic caught up in a terror-filled quest in a ghoulish playground for the undead and the unworldly." Isn't that what we've been through this Easter? We had horror. Jesus hung on a cross, speared by a centurion, jeered by a crowd, then carried to a cave for burial, where finally he disappeared. All the ingredients for a horror film. But it didn't end there, because as you heard from our reading from Steve in Luke 24, Jesus reappeared to the travellers. One named Cleopas, and the other, well, actually we don't know who the other one was. Maybe it was Mrs. Cleopas. We don't know. They were walking to Emmaus, a place we know little about, except it is understood it is 7 miles from Jerusalem. It's rumoured somewhere, or I've read somewhere, it's a village with hot springs. North, south, east or west, doesn't say. We don't know. Now the only Emmaus that I know, especially here in Brighton, is the charity, where we give all unwanted furniture, etc. Now these two travellers had been to celebrate the Passover, a religious obligation for every faithful Jewish male living within 15 miles of the city. Something we, as the village MCC, replicated at our Seder meal before the last Good Friday. Going back to our travellers, while they were walking, a person joined them and started discussing Jesus of Nazareth and all the things he had done. Now these two had been following this Jesus they were talking about for some considerable time. Wouldn't you think that at some point on this long walk, either Cleopas or his missus would have recognised him? Were they blind? They had known him in Jerusalem. Was he incognito, veiled, a ghost, or what? It has been suggested that they were too grief-stricken, too shaken by what they had seen, that was the reason. Now, over the years, I have known several people who have lost someone close to them, and the grief has really put them in a bit of a daze. So maybe that was because they were really close to Jesus. Okay, it makes you numb. In any case, don't you know that if you or I had been there, we would have known who he was? As I get on, I sometimes find I have difficulties putting name to a face. Probably happens to you. Have you had occasion to try and remember a name to that face? Maybe if we were under a terrific time of stress, we may not even remember the face. Who knows? Jesus joined them as a stranger and asked them what they were talking about. They stopped walking, their faces reflecting their sadness, looked at him, said, "Are you the only person from Jerusalem who missed the happenings in the holy city these last few days?" "What do you mean?" the stranger asked. "Oh, we had a dream. We hoped he would be the one, the Messiah, the one to set Israel free. But the freedom we wanted was thrown away. They arrested him. They tried him. They murdered him on the cross. Don't you know about that?" Well, they must have discussed quite a lot more, because they had walked almost 7 miles and the sun was setting as they entered Emmaus. So, just as any good Jewish person would do, Cleopas offers the hospitality of his home to this stranger. After all, he was quite interesting. Upon entering their home, they invite him to dinner with the bread and the wine. We now hear and as we now hear, every time that we celebrate the Lord's Supper, we get that feeling we should recognize Christ. But just as he blessed the bread and the wine, it was then their eyes were opened and they recognized him. Why now? Was it because the light from the candles was just right on his face? Or they had eaten with him before? Maybe they saw how he broke the bread and shared the wine. Whatever it was, they finally grasped here was the person they had seen put to death. They realized then that here was Jesus, the man who had walked chatting with them for all those miles. But just then, just like a horror movie, bang, he disappeared. Pretty big stuff. And so with night drawing on, they decided to return to Jerusalem immediately. They were so excited. Several things striking about this story. One of them is how incredibly normal these 2 disciples were. How suddenly a stranger joins them as they walk and talk. They don't recognize him. After all, Jesus is the last person they would expect to see. This story is especially significant for people like you and me. You see, these disciples were not part of the original 12 apostles, the inner core of Jesus' circle. Yet they were central characters in what must be the most heartwarming of all the resurrection accounts. It does not matter that these two disciples were not part of that inner circle. What mattered was that Jesus loved them and they felt they needed his presence. They had been broken-hearted and shattered by the horror of his death in those last 3 days. We're left to wonder how much of that last week of his earthly life the two walkers had been part of. We don't know. Had they seen the trial, witnessed the cruelty on the cross, or even known about the disappearance of the body? Then they were on their way home. All hopes of a Messiah swept away by what had happened. Feeling defeated, disappointed, all dreams of a new start washed away. They looked back and they actually remembered that sometime Jesus had said he would rise again. Maybe that's what it is. It had come true. Another horror movie? No. He had come true. He had risen again. They had seen him. The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to them. They go back to the city and they tell the other disciples what they had experienced. It was going to be the hardest thing they had to do, to make all those others believe him. So after all that, what does it tell us? It is not about who we are, but who God is. Jesus came to the ordinary, the everyday people who took time to know who he really was. But when they did, they had to tell everybody. Here, when we meet at the village MCC, isn't that what we do? When we take communion, we see Jesus. The truth be told, God is not always easy to see. Even when we're looking, even when we're trying really hard, it is so difficult to see God. I'm going to finish with a verse which I think ties everything up here. Sacred moments, the moments of miracle, are often everyday moments. The moments which, if we do not look with more than our eyes, or listen with more than our ears, they only reveal a garden, a stranger coming down the road behind us, a meal like any other ordinary meal. But if we look with our hearts, if we listen with our being, if we feel our faith and see with our imagination, we may see Jesus. And if we look carefully, he is there with us every single day. Amen.
Amen.